The dust was a living thing. It coated the tongue, settled in the lungs, and painted the world in a monochrome shade of despair. It rose from the cracked earth in lazy, shimmering veils, stirred by a wind that offered no relief, only the dry, rasping scent of sage and sun-baked rock. This was Caleb's world, a kingdom of silence and solitude carved from the unforgiving hide of the territory. The silence was his oldest companion, a vast, breathing presence that filled the spaces between the lonely cry of a hawk and the rhythmic thud of his own axe splitting wood. His hands, calloused and mapped with the fine white lines of old scars, knew the language of labor. They knew the heft of the axe, the smooth grip of a rifle stock, and the unforgiving pull of a plow through stubborn soil. They did not know the touch of another. He stood on the porch of his cabin, a structure as stark and weathered as himself. The wood had been bleached to the color of bone by a relentless sun, and the single glass window stared out at the sprawling emptiness like a blind eye. He squinted toward the horizon, where the wagon trail dissolved into a heat-haze mirage. He was expecting a man. A letter, 6 months old and creased from countless readings, had promised help. A man named May, from a contact in San Francisco who arranged labor. Strong, the letter said, willing to work for board and a small wage. Caleb needed the strength. The ranch, if one could call his 160 acres of struggle a ranch, was more than one man could tame. The spring that bled from the rocks at the northern edge of his property was a constant battle to maintain, and the fences were a perpetual project of mending and cursing. The silence was broken first by a faint, rhythmic creaking, a sound that grew until it resolved into the groan of wagon wheels and the tired plodding of horses. The weekly stage was early. Caleb's jaw tightened. He disliked disruptions, and the stagecoach was a noisy, jarring intrusion, a reminder of a world of crowds and chatter he had deliberately left behind. He watched it crawl closer, a black beetle against the ochre landscape, trailing its own plume of dust like a banner of unwelcome news. It shuddered to a halt before his turnoff, and the driver, a man whose face was a permanent squint against the glare, hollered something Caleb didn't bother to decipher. A figure descended from the coach. The shape was wrong. Too small, too slender. The sun caught the color of the person's dress, a deep, impossible blue, the color of a twilight sky just after the last embers of sunset have died. It was the color of memories he kept locked away. As the dust settled, the figure became a woman, a Chinese woman. She stood beside a single dark-lacquered trunk, her posture impossibly straight, her hands clasped before her. She was a brushstroke of delicate ink on a canvas of raw, brutal earth. Caleb's boots crunched on the gravel as he walked toward her, his mind a slow churn of confusion and rising irritation. The stage driver gave him a weary, indifferent shrug and climbed back onto his seat. With a crack of the whip and a jangle of harnesses, the coach lumbered away, leaving the woman and her trunk standing in a fresh cloud of settling dust. She did not cough. She did not wave a hand to clear the air. She simply stood, a statue of quiet dignity, her gaze fixed on him as he approached. Her face was serene, her features fine and precisely carved. Her dark hair was bound in a severe, intricate knot at the nape of her neck. She was not what he had ordered. She was the furthest thing from it. He stopped a few feet from her, the silence stretching between them, thick and heavy with the heat. He was a large man, built of the same hard-packed earth and timber as his home, and he knew he cast a long and intimidating shadow. She did not flinch. "May?" he asked, the name feeling foreign and absurd on his tongue. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "I am Mei Ling," she corrected him, her voice quiet but clear, with an accent that smoothed the edges of the words. Caleb's frustration hardened into a knot in his gut. This was a mistake, a catastrophic, ridiculous mistake. He had sent money for a field hand, a man who could help him wrestle this land into submission. He had received a woman who looked as if a harsh wind could shatter her. He gestured vaguely, helplessly, at the vast, empty landscape around them. "There's been an error," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I was expecting a laborer, a man." Her expression did not change. Her dark eyes, calm and observant, held his. The arrangement was made. The passage was paid. The arrangement was for a man named May. He repeated, clipping the words. "Not a Mei Ling." He ran a hand over his face, the rasp of his stubble loud in the quiet. This was a disaster. The stage wouldn't be back for a week. No. The driver had said something about the northern pass. An early snow was predicted. It might be a month. A month. He looked at her, at the impractical silk of her dress, at her small, clean hands. What in God's name was he supposed to do with her? "You should not have gotten off the coach," he said, the statement both an accusation and a lament for a problem that was now his. "The driver said this was the place," she replied, her composure absolute. "The agreement said I was to be met here. I am here." Her logic was as simple and unyielding as a river stone. He had no argument against it. He looked from her to the cabin, then back again. The sheer monumental inconvenience of it all settled on him like a shroud. He had built his life around a singular, solitary purpose: to be left alone, to work until exhaustion silenced the ghosts that whispered in the quiet hours. This woman, with her calm eyes and her blue dress, was a breach in the fortress of his solitude. He let out a long, slow breath that tasted of dust and defeat. "The coach is not coming back," he said, more to himself than to her. "Not for a while." She nodded again, as if this were a simple fact of the weather, of no more consequence than the position of the sun. He looked at her trunk. It looked heavy. He looked at her. She looked fragile. He felt a surge of resentment, hot and useless. It wasn't her fault, not really. It was the fault of some faceless agent in a crowded city, a man who had likely pocketed half the money and sent the first person available to get rid of her. Without another word, he turned, strode to the trunk, and hoisted it onto his shoulder. The wood was solid, the weight substantial. He grunted under the load and started the walk back to the cabin, not looking to see if she followed. He heard the soft, steady crunch of her smaller steps on the dirt behind him. He set the trunk down on the porch with a heavy thud that shook the boards. He pushed open the door to his home and stepped aside. The inside of the cabin was one large room, a testament to pure function over comfort. A stone fireplace, stained with soot, dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed, covered with a patched quilt, was tucked into a corner. Shelves holding tins of food, sacks of flour, and a sparse collection of plates and mugs lined the wall opposite the door. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and coffee. It was a man's space, disordered and Spartan. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight slanting through the window. He watched her as she stepped inside. Her gaze swept the room, not with judgment, but with a quiet, thorough assessment. She took in the clutter, the layer of dust on the mantel, the stack of unwashed dishes by the water basin. He expected a gasp, a look of dismay, some sign of the city-bred horror he assumed she must feel. He saw nothing. Her face remained a mask of placid observation. This unnerved him more than any outburst would have. He felt a defensive bristle, a need to justify the state of his life. "This is it," he said, the words gruff. "There's a loft. You can have it." He gestured to a wooden ladder leading to a small, dark space under the eaves. He slept on the main bed. It was the only concession he could make. She looked up at the loft, then back at him. She gave that same maddeningly small nod. He felt an urge to shake her, to demand some kind of emotional response, any response at all. He wanted to see fear or anger or disappointment, anything but this profound, unreadable calm. The first days of their forced cohabitation were a war of silences. Caleb rose before dawn, his movements loud and deliberate in the small space. He would light the fire, make coffee, and be out the door before she descended the ladder. He worked himself to the point of collapse, felling trees, mending fences, clearing rocks from a field he hoped one day would grow something other than weeds. He was trying to outrun her presence, to exhaust himself so thoroughly that he would not have the energy to think about the woman sleeping under his roof. But her presence lingered. It was in the subtle changes inside the cabin. When he returned at dusk, bone-weary and grim, the chaos had been tamed. The dishes were washed and stacked. The floor was swept. His spare tools, which had been scattered in a corner, were now arranged neatly against the wall. A quiet order was being imposed upon his life, and he did not know how to feel about it. He found his spare shirt, the one with the torn sleeve, lying folded on his bed. The tear was gone, replaced by a line of stitches so fine and even they were nearly invisible. He ran his thumb over the seam, a strange feeling twisting in his chest. It felt like an accusation. She was the first test. He had assumed, with the certainty of a man who knew only one way of life, that she would be helpless. A city woman, accustomed to comforts he could not even name, would surely break under the strain of this existence. He expected tears. He expected complaints. He expected her to beg him to take her to the nearest town, a 2-day ride he had no intention of making. He received none of it. Instead, he observed her. From the corner of his eye, while he sharpened his axe or cleaned his rifle, he watched her move. There was no wasted motion. She learned the rhythms of the homestead with an unnerving speed. She discovered the hand pump for the well was stiff and, after watching him struggle with it, found a can of grease in his shed and worked it into the joint until it moved smoothly. He came back one afternoon to find she had taken his meager inventory of dried beans, salted pork, and flour, and was making a stew that filled the cabin with a rich, savory aroma he hadn't smelled in years. He sat at his table and she placed a bowl in front of him. He ate in silence, the food a revelation. It was simple fare, the same ingredients he ate day in and day out, but she had transformed them. He could taste herbs he didn't know he possessed, which she had found growing wild behind the cabin. He finished the bowl, and she refilled it without a word. The meal was an act of profound competence, a statement made without language. It was the first crack in the wall of his skepticism. This woman was not fragile. She was something else. A fragile truce settled over the cabin, built not on words, but on shared tasks and mutual observation. He learned to anticipate the pot of hot coffee waiting for him when he came in from the cold. She learned the sound of his footsteps and would have a basin of hot water ready for him to wash the grime of the day from his hands. They moved around each other in a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance and accommodation. The silence remained, but its character changed. It was no longer a void, but a space filled with unspoken awareness. He watched her one evening as she sat at the table, a small ledger and a pencil in her hands. The ledger was one he had discarded, but she had smoothed its pages. In precise, elegant columns of characters he could not read, she was tracking his supplies. She was calculating how long the flour would last, how many tins of peaches remained, how much salted pork they had. She was bringing order to his world, an order he hadn't even realized was missing. He saw then that her quietness was not passivity, it was observation. Her stillness was not weakness. It was a coiled strength, a waiting efficiency. His respect for her grew grudgingly at first, then with a steady, undeniable certainty. He began to leave the cabin's interior entirely to her domain. He would bring in wood and water, and she would transform the raw materials of his life into a semblance of a home. The change was subtle but profound. The cabin began to lose its edge of raw survival and take on a feeling of habitation. It was cleaner. It was warmer. It was less lonely, even in its silence. The first snow came early, as the stage driver had predicted. It began as a fine, whispering powder, then thickened into a blinding curtain of white. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin, a mournful, predatory sound. The world shrank to the four walls of their shared space. For days they were trapped. Caleb worked in the attached shed, mending harnesses and oiling his tools. Mei Ling sat by the fire, mending his clothes, her needle moving with a swift, hypnotic rhythm. During the worst of the storm, a section of the roof he'd long meant to fix finally gave way. A steady drip of icy water began to fall near the hearth. Before he could even fetch a bucket, she was there. She'd climbed onto a chair, examining the leak with a focused intensity. She pointed to a spot a few feet away from the drip. "The hole is not there," she said, her first unsolicited words about the running of the house. "It is here. The water runs down the beam." He was about to argue, but something in her certainty stopped him. He climbed up himself and saw she was right. The crack was almost invisible, a hairline fracture he had missed a dozen times. Her perception, her ability to see the flaw in the structure was sharper than his. Together, in the dim, fire-lit cabin, they patched the roof from the inside using a spare piece of tin and a bucket of pitch. They worked side by side, their hands occasionally brushing, their movements synchronized. When it was done, they stood back, the dripping silenced. In that moment, a new understanding passed between them, a recognition of mutual capability. The line between master of the house and unwanted guest had blurred into something new. They were partners in survival. The world outside their cabin, however, had not changed. When the snow finally melted enough for travel, the threat that had been a distant shadow on the horizon finally rode into view. It came in the form of 3 men on horseback, their figures dark against the white landscape. Caleb recognized the man in the lead instantly. Bartholomew Thorne, a man who bought land the way a locust consumed a field, leaving nothing but ruin behind. Thorne owned the valley, all except for Caleb's 160 acres, and Thorne wanted his spring. Thorne reined in his horse a few yards from the porch, his eyes small and greedy, taking in the small signs of improvement, the neatly stacked firewood, the smoke curling from the chimney. His gaze fell on Mei Ling, who had come to stand in the doorway behind Caleb. A cruel, insinuating smile spread across Thorne's fleshy face. "Well, now, Caleb," Thorne drawled, his voice thick with false bonhomie, "looks like you've finally decided to civilize this pigsty. Got yourself some domestic help." His eyes lingered on Mei Ling, stripping her of dignity with their insolent appraisal. And an exotic one at that. A mail-order China doll to warm your bed? Caleb's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He felt a surge of protective fury so intense it made his vision swim. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Thorne and the doorway, shielding Mei Ling from view. "State your business, Thorne, then get off my land." Thorne's smile vanished, replaced by a sneer. "Your land? That's a temporary arrangement. I've made you a fair offer. It's my final one. $500 for this worthless patch of rock. You take it, or my next offer will be delivered with fire." He spat on the ground, the dark spittle a stain against the clean snow. "And I'll take the girl as a bonus." The insult hung in the cold, clean air, ugly and poisonous. Caleb felt Mei Ling stiffen behind him. The humiliation was a shared one, a public branding of them both. He knew he could not win a straight fight. Thorne had a dozen men on his payroll, men who would burn a man's home for a month's wages and a bottle of whiskey. "You have your answer," Caleb said, his voice dangerously low. "Leave." Thorne laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Have it your way, you stubborn fool." He wheeled his horse around, his men following suit. "Don't say I didn't warn you," he shouted over his shoulder as they rode away, their horses kicking up slush and mud. The silence they left behind was heavy with menace. The confrontation had changed everything. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a face and a name, and it had, inexplicably, bound him and Mei Ling together. She was no longer just a woman stranded at his cabin. She was the woman Thorne had insulted. She was under his protection. The unspoken contract of their cohabitation had been rewritten in the space of a single, ugly conversation. They were no longer just two people sharing a roof. They were a side, and Thorne was the enemy. In the days that followed, a grim tension settled over the ranch. Caleb spent his time reinforcing the cabin, boarding up the small back window, and checking his supply of ammunition. He worked with a feverish intensity, his movements sharp and economical. He was preparing for a siege. Mei Ling watched him, her expression unreadable. She did not ask questions. She simply adapted to the new reality. She began to ration their food more strictly, her precise calculations ensuring their supplies would last as long as possible. She boiled extra water and stored it in every available container. Her quiet, methodical preparations were a silent acknowledgement of the danger they faced. She was not panicking. She was planning. The attack came not with fire, but with water, or the lack of it. One morning, Caleb went to the spring and found it reduced to a muddy trickle. Thorne's men had worked overnight, damming the source further up the mountain on Thorne's property. They were going to choke him out, to make the land unlivable. It was a crueler, smarter attack than fire. It was a slow death sentence. Desperation was a cold knot in Caleb's stomach. Without the spring, his cattle would die. He would die. The land would be worthless. He stood by the dying creek bed, the full weight of his defeat pressing down on him. He had lost. He had held out for years against Thorne's greed, fueled by a stubborn pride and a promise he had made to his dead wife to never sell this land. Now, that promise was turning to dust, just like the creek bed. He returned to the cabin, his face a mask of grim despair. He didn't have to say a word. Mei Ling looked at him, then at the empty water buckets in his hands, and she understood. She poured him a cup of coffee from their carefully rationed supply of boiled water. He sank into a chair at the table, the fight gone out of him. "He's won," Caleb said, the words tasting like ash. "There's nothing I can do." She sat opposite him, her hands folded on the table. The silence in the room was absolute. He expected her to cry, to finally show the fear he had been anticipating for weeks. Instead, her gaze was clear and focused. "To give up is to let him win," she said softly. "Is there no other way?" "There is no other way," he said, his voice flat. "The law in this territory belongs to the man with the most money, and that's Thorn." He looked around the cabin at the small home they had inadvertently built together. The thought of surrendering it to a man like Thorn was a physical pain. This forced a new kind of crisis. His isolation, his self-reliance, had been his shield for so long, but it had also been his cage. Now, faced with a problem he could not solve with his fists or his rifle, he was adrift. He found himself talking to her, the words spilling out of him in a torrent of frustration. He told her about Thorn, about his relentless campaign to own the entire valley, about the other ranchers he had bullied and bought out. He told her about the deed to his land, a document his father had filed 30 years ago, a document that was supposed to be ironclad. She listened, her head tilted slightly, her eyes never leaving his face. When he was finished, the cabin was quiet again. He felt drained, empty. He had laid his failure bare before this stranger. "May I see the papers?" she asked. He looked at her, confused. "What for?" "Please," she insisted, her voice gentle but firm. He hesitated, then shrugged. What did it matter? He retrieved a worn leather pouch from his trunk and dumped its contents onto the table. It was a messy collection of receipts, old letters, and, at the bottom, the folded, yellowed deed to the property. She took the deed, her fingers surprisingly steady, and carefully unfolded it. Her eyes scanned the document, moving over the legal jargon and the faded signatures. She spent a long time looking at it, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then she took out another document, a survey map that had been folded with the deed. She spread it out, her slender finger tracing the lines that marked the boundaries of his property, the location of the spring. "This map," she said, her voice sharp with a new intensity. "It was filed with the deed?" "My father had it done," Caleb said, "by the territorial surveyor. It's official." "The spring," she said, tapping a point on the map. "It is marked here, and the source is marked here." Her finger moved up, beyond the line of his property, onto the area marked as Thorn's land. "The law of this territory. It is based on prior appropriation, yes? The first to use the water has the right to the water?" Caleb stared at her. "Yes, that's the law. But the source is on his land. He can do what he wants with it." "No," she said, a startling firmness in her tone. "The right is attached to the land where the water is first put to beneficial use. Your father used this spring for his cattle 20 years before Thorn ever bought that mountain. The right to that water, all of it, belongs to this ranch. Damming the source is theft. It is not just immoral, it is illegal." He stared at her, dumbfounded. The words, the legal terms, sounded strange and foreign coming from her lips. "How do you know this?" A flicker of something, pride, or perhaps a painful memory, crossed her face. "In San Francisco, I did not work in a laundry. My father was a scholar. He taught me to read and write English, and to read the law. I worked as a clerk for a land rights lawyer. I copied documents like this every day. I know this law." The revelation struck him with the force of a physical blow. This whole time he had seen her as a displaced, helpless woman, a burden he had to bear. He had never once considered the world she came from, the knowledge she might possess. Her hidden strength was not just in her resilience or her quiet competence. It was in her mind. She possessed a weapon he never could have imagined, a weapon of ink and paper and legal precedent. Hope, a feeling so long dormant he had forgotten its texture, began to stir within him. But how can we prove it? Thorne has the sheriff in his pocket. "We do not go to the sheriff," she said, her eyes gleaming with a fierce intelligence. "We go to the town. We make it public. A man like Thorne, he fears shame more than the law. He hides his crimes. We will bring them into the light." Her plan was audacious and terrifying. It involved a public confrontation, a battle of words and wits against a man who preferred to settle disputes with hired guns. But as he looked at her, at the quiet certainty on her face, he felt his own courage returning. For the first time in a long time, he was not alone in his fight. To protect her, to give her any standing to even speak on his behalf, there was only one way. It was a mad idea, born of desperation and a sudden, fierce need to bind her to him, to make her untouchable. "We'll need a reason to be there together," he said, the words coming out rough. "A reason for you to have any say in my affairs." He looked at her, his gaze direct. "We'll tell them we're getting married." She looked back at him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of shock in her eyes. But it was followed by a slow, deliberate nod. It was a business transaction, a strategy. But as the word "married" hung in the air between them, it felt like something more. The town was a single dusty street, lined with false-fronted buildings. On the day of the circuit judge's visit, it was crowded with ranchers, prospectors, and merchants. Caleb and Mei Ling walked down the center of that street, the focus of every curious, suspicious eye. He had bought her a new dress, a simple one of dark green calico, and he wore his least-worn shirt. They looked respectable, but they did not look like they belonged together. The whispers followed them like a trail of snakes in the dust. They went directly to the justice of the peace, a harried man with ink stains on his fingers. Caleb stated their intention, his voice flat and unadorned. The justice looked from Caleb's grim face to Mei Ling's placid one, his expression a mixture of confusion and disapproval. But the fee was paid, the paperwork was in order, and there was no legal reason to refuse. He agreed to perform the ceremony on the steps of the land office that afternoon, before the judge held court. Word spread through the town like wildfire. A wedding. The solitary, grim-faced rancher Caleb marrying a Chinese woman who had appeared from nowhere. It was a scandal. It was a spectacle. By the time they stood on the steps, a crowd had gathered. They were not there to celebrate. They were there to watch, to judge, to witness the strange union. Caleb could feel their stares, a physical pressure on his back. He stood tall, his hands at his sides, his face set like stone. Beside him, Mei Ling was a pillar of calm, her eyes fixed on the horizon. And then Thorne arrived. He pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his men flanking him. His face was a mask of triumphant scorn. He had come to enjoy his victory, to watch Caleb's final humiliation. The justice of the peace began the ceremony, his voice stumbling over the words, eager to have it done. He spoke of unions and partnerships, the words hollow and meaningless in the face of the crowd's hostility. The townspeople murmured, some laughing outright. They mocked the bride at her own wedding, their prejudice a thick, suffocating blanket. Caleb felt Mei Ling's hand tremble slightly where it rested on his arm, the first sign of fear he had ever seen from her. A cold, hard rage settled in his chest. If any man has cause why these two should not be joined, Let him speak now or forever hold his peace, the justice mumbled, racing to the end. I have cause, Thorne boomed, stepping forward. The crowd fell silent. This was the drama they had been waiting for. This whole affair is a sham, a fraud. Thorne pointed a thick finger at Caleb. This man is a squatter on land that rightfully belongs to me. He has no assets, no prospects. He's trying to use this creature to create some kind of legal entanglement. The land claim is under dispute, and this marriage is a pathetic attempt to complicate the matter. Every eye turned to Caleb. He was expected to argue, to bluster, to fight. They expected him to use his fists. He felt the weight of their judgment, the certainty of his defeat in their eyes. He looked at Thorne's leering face, and then he turned and looked at Mai Ling. Her face was pale, but her chin was high. In her eyes, he did not see a business partner or a legal strategist. He saw a woman, alone and vulnerable, who had placed her trust in him. He had brought her into this. He had to see her through it. The crowd waited. The silence stretched. Caleb took a breath. He looked directly at Thorne, his gaze flat and cold as a winter river. Then he said one word. Mine. The word was not shouted. It was a low, guttural declaration, a statement of absolute ownership. It landed in the silence with the force of a hammer blow. The crowd, which had been ready to jeer, was stunned into stillness. The word was a shield and a sword. It was raw, possessive, and utterly unambiguous. He wasn't just talking about the land. He was talking about the woman beside him. He was drawing a line in the dust for all the world to see, and he was daring anyone to cross it. Thorne, for a moment, was speechless, but before he could recover, Mai Ling stepped forward. Her movement was fluid and graceful. She held the deed and the survey map in her hand. This marriage is not a fraud, she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the tension. It was the first time most of them had heard her speak more than a single word. But the claim of Mr. Thorne is... She held up the map. This is the official survey map of Caleb's property, filed 30 years ago. It clearly marks the Arrowhead Spring. And this, she held up the deed, is the legal document granting him and his heirs primary water rights based on first use, as per Territorial Statute 4, Section 2. Mr. Thorne's recent damming of the spring's source is a criminal act of water theft. She turned her gaze to Thorne, her eyes like chips of obsidian. Furthermore, I have examined the bill of sale for Mr. Thorne's adjacent property. The signature of the seller, a Mr. Abram, is a forgery. I suspect if the circuit judge were to compare it to Mr. Abram's signature on file at the land office, he would find a significant discrepancy. I believe Mr. Abram did not sell his land. I believe he was driven off it, just as Mr. Thorne is trying to drive off Caleb. A collective gasp went through the crowd. She had not just defended Caleb, she had launched a devastating counterattack. She had accused the most powerful man in the valley of forgery and theft, citing statutes and evidence like a seasoned lawyer. The circuit judge, who had been watching from the doorway of the land office, pushed his way through the crowd, his expression grim. Thorne's face had turned a mottled, furious red. He was sputtering, his blustering confidence completely shattered. This is preposterous. Lies from a foreign whore. Before the insult was fully out of his mouth, Caleb moved. He did not throw a punch. He simply stepped in front of Mai Ling, his body a solid wall between her and Thorne. His hand rested on the worn grip of the pistol at his hip. It was not a threat. It was a promise. The circuit judge laid a heavy hand on Thorne's shoulder. "I think, Mr. Thorne," the judge said, his voice cold, "you and I had better have a look at those signatures." The defeat was absolute. It was not just legal, it was public. Thorne's power, built on fear and intimidation, crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. The sheriff, his face a mixture of fear and grudging duty, placed Thorne under arrest. The crowd, which had come to mock, began to disperse in stunned, respectful silence. They had witnessed something they did not understand, a partnership of quiet strength and sharp intellect that had toppled the tyrant. In the sudden quiet, Caleb and Mei Ling stood alone on the steps. The justice of the peace, looking flustered, quickly finished the ceremony. "I now pronounce you man and wife." The words, which had been part of a desperate strategy, now felt real, heavy with a new and unexpected meaning. Caleb had a scratch on his cheek from where one of Thorne's men had shoved past him. He barely felt it. He looked at Mei Ling, his wife. Her composure was back, but there was a new light in her eyes. He reached out and, his gesture clumsy and unpracticed, touched her arm. "Let's go home," he said. The ride back to the ranch was silent, but the silence was different. It was a shared space, comfortable and calm. When they arrived, the cabin looked the same, but everything had changed. It was no longer his cabin that she was staying in. It was their home. That night, she tended to the scratch on his cheek with a soft cloth and some salve. Her touch was light, professional, but it sent a jolt through him. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a problem or an asset, but as the woman who had stood with him, who had fought for him with a courage he had never seen before. Weeks passed. The snow melted for good, revealing the green shoots of spring. Thorne was gone, his empire dismantled by the federal court. The valley was quiet. The spring on Caleb's land flowed freely once more, its gurgle a constant, happy sound. The townspeople treated them with a distant, cautious respect. They were an enigma, the silent rancher and his brilliant, quiet wife. Their life fell into a new rhythm, one of easy partnership. They spoke more now, not in long conversations, but in small, meaningful exchanges. He would tell her about the cattle, and she would tell him about the garden she had started planting near the house, her neat rows of seeds a promise of future growth. One evening, he sat on the porch, carving a piece of scrap wood. He was not a skilled artist, but his hands were patient. He worked until the shape of a small, elegant bird emerged from the wood. He sanded it smooth and handed it to her without a word. She took it, her fingers tracing its delicate lines. Her smile was a small, rare, and beautiful thing. A few days later, the official, amended deed arrived from the territorial capital. It declared his ownership and water rights to be absolute and incontestable. He sat at the table, looking at the document that had secured his future, their future. He uncapped the inkwell, dipped the pen, and, next to his own name, in careful, deliberate letters, he wrote hers, Mei Ling. She came to stand behind him, looking over his shoulder at the paper. She saw her name, entwined with his on the legal foundation of their lives. He turned his head to look up at her. He did not have the words for the feelings that filled his chest, the gratitude, the respect, the deep, quiet affection. So he used the only words he knew, the practical, solid words of his world. He tapped the paper. "Our home," he said. She placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and certain. "Yes," she whispered, "our home." On the porch, the setting sun painted the sky in the shades of bruised purple and soft rose. and the silence that settled over the small cabin was no longer the silence of solitude or loneliness. It was the silence of peace.